Marcus Thompson. Never thought he'd see the day when his own government would abandon him. The former Marine Corps sergeant had served 2 tours in Afghanistan, earned a Purple Heart, and returned home to build a quiet life in the small town of Millbrook, Montana. He worked as a mechanic at the local garage, lived in a modest apartment above the hardware store, and kept to himself. That was before the blackout started. The power grid failures began sporadically in major cities along the coasts. At first, the news reported them as isolated incidents, cyber attacks, they said, or aging infrastructure finally giving out. Marcus watched the coverage with growing unease, his military training making him notice patterns that others missed. The blackouts weren't random. They were systematic, coordinated, and spreading inland like a slow-moving plague. When the lights went out in Millbrook on a Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was under the hood of Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison's patrol car. The engine died mid-repair, the garage door opener stopped responding, and even Jake's radio went silent. They looked at each other in the sudden quiet, both men understanding immediately that this wasn't a simple power outage. "How long you think we got?" Jake asked, his hand instinctively moving to his service weapon. Marcus straightened up, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. "Depends on how prepared folks are. Could be days, could be weeks before things get bad." But Marcus was wrong. It took less than 48 hours for civilization to start crumbling in Millbrook. Without power, the grocery stores couldn't process transactions. The gas stations couldn't pump fuel. The water treatment plant shut down. Cell towers went dark. The townspeople, who had always prided themselves on their self-reliance, quickly discovered how dependent they'd become on the grid. By the 3rd day, Mayor Richard Hawthorne had declared a state of emergency and established what he called temporary resource management protocols. In practice, this meant his cronies on the town council, wealthy business owners who'd always run Millbrook like their personal fiefdom, were now rationing food and water while hoarding the best supplies for themselves. Marcus had been expecting something like this. He'd seen how quickly order could collapse in war zones, how power vacuums got filled by whoever was most ruthless, not most qualified. What he hadn't expected was being deliberately excluded from the mayor's Citizen Response Committee, despite his military background and obvious qualifications. The exclusion became clear when he volunteered his services at the emergency town meeting held in the high school gymnasium. The building was packed, lit by battery-powered lanterns and filled with worried faces. Marcus stood up when Mayor Hawthorne asked for volunteers with relevant skills. "I'm trained in crisis management and have experience with resource allocation in hostile environments," Marcus said, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room. "I'd like to help coordinate security and distribution efforts." The mayor's face hardened. "We appreciate the offer, Marcus, but we're looking for people with local ties and community investment. People who understand how Millbrook works." It was a polite way of saying Marcus didn't belong, despite having lived there for 3 years. The real reason became apparent when Marcus noticed who was on the committee. Mayor Hawthorne's brother-in-law, who owned the largest hardware store in town. The bank president, who'd been foreclosing on family farms for decades. The grocery store owner, who'd been price gouging residents for years. These weren't the most qualified people to handle a crisis. They were the ones who stood to benefit most from controlling the response. Marcus felt a familiar anger rising in his chest, the same feeling he'd had watching corrupt officials in Afghanistan profit from American aid while soldiers died. But this was different. This was home. These were people he'd trusted, people he'd helped, people who were now willing to let their neighbors suffer to maintain their own power. As the meeting broke up, Marcus caught Jake Morrison's eye. The deputy sheriff looked troubled, his jaw set in a hard line. They'd served together briefly in the National Guard before Marcus's deployment, and Jake knew Marcus's character better than most. "This isn't right," Jake said quietly as they walked out together. "We need people like you making decisions, not those old boys." Marcus nodded grimly. "They're making a mistake. When people get desperate, they won't care about committee appointments." He was right, but even Marcus couldn't predict how quickly everything would spiral out of control, or how far the mayor's committee would go to maintain their grip on power. The real war for survival was just beginning, and the enemy wasn't some foreign invader, it was the corruption that had been festering in Millbrook's heart for decades. The first crack in Mayor Hawthorne's authority came on day 6, when Martha Rodriguez collapsed outside the community center. The 62-year-old widow had been waiting in line for 3 hours for her daily water ration, only to be told that supplies were running low and families with children would be prioritized. Martha had no children, no husband, and no connections to the mayor's inner circle. She was expendable. Marcus found her sitting on the curb, tears streaming down her weathered face. He recognized her from the hardware store where he lived. She was the one who always brought him homemade cookies and asked about his day. Now she looked fragile, defeated, like so many civilians he'd seen in war zones who'd lost everything. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Marcus said gently, kneeling beside her. "What happened?" "They said I don't qualify for water today," she whispered. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, raised my kids here, buried my husband here. But I don't qualify." Marcus felt his jaw clench. He'd seen this before, the systematic dehumanization of the vulnerable, the way those in power convinced themselves that some people mattered less than others. It was a slippery slope that led to atrocities, and he'd sworn never to let it happen on his watch again. "Come on," he said, helping her to her feet. "Let's get you some water." Marcus led Martha to his apartment, where he'd been stockpiling supplies since the blackouts began. He gave her a gallon of water from his personal reserve, along with some canned food and a battery-powered radio. As she thanked him with tears in her eyes, he made a decision that would change everything. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I need you to do something for me," he said. "I need you to tell people that if they can't get help from the committee, they can come to me." Quietly. "Can you do that?" Word spread quickly through Millbrook's network of excluded residents. By the end of the week, Marcus had a steady stream of visitors. Elderly people who'd been deemed non-essential, single mothers who couldn't navigate the committee's bureaucracy, disabled residents who couldn't stand in long lines, and anyone else who didn't have connections to the mayor's circle. Marcus organized them into what he called neighborhood support groups. Each group was responsible for checking on their immediate neighbors, sharing resources and reporting problems. It was a system he'd learned from counterinsurgency operations, but adapted for community building instead of warfare. The mayor noticed the unauthorized activity within days. On Sunday morning, Deputy Morrison showed up at Marcus's apartment with a grim expression. "I've got to ask you to stop," Jake said without preamble. "Mayor's orders. He says you're undermining the official response and creating confusion." Marcus poured coffee for both of them, moving slowly to keep his anger in check. "Jake, you know what's really going on here. They're letting people suffer to maintain control." "Maybe so," Jake admitted. "But I've got a job to do and a family to protect. I can't afford to make enemies of the people running this town." It was the answer Marcus had expected, but it still stung. Jake Morrison was a good man, but he was also a man with responsibilities that went beyond doing what was right. Marcus understood that, but he also understood that sometimes good people had to make hard choices. "I hear you," Marcus said finally. "But I'm not going to stop helping people just because it makes the mayor uncomfortable." Jake nodded slowly. "I figured you'd say that. Just, be careful, okay? They're talking about more than just asking nicely next time." After Jake left, Marcus sat alone in his apartment, staring out at the darkened town below. He'd faced this choice before in Afghanistan: follow orders that he knew were wrong, or do what his conscience demanded and face the consequences. The first time he'd chosen to follow orders. It had cost innocent lives and earned him a Purple Heart when he tried to make amends. This time he wouldn't make the same mistake. That evening, Marcus held his first official meeting of what would become known as the Millbrook Mutual Aid Network. 37 people showed up in the basement of the old Lutheran church, their faces illuminated by candles and battery-powered lanterns. They were teachers and nurses, mechanics and farmers, retirees and young parents, all united by their exclusion from the mayor's preferred circle. "We're not here to oppose the official response," Marcus told them. "We're here to fill the gaps. To make sure nobody gets left behind." But even as he spoke those words, Marcus knew that the mayor wouldn't see it that way. In Richard Hawthorne's mind, any organization he didn't control was a threat to his authority. The battle lines were being drawn, and Marcus had just chosen his side. The confrontation Marcus had been expecting came on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the blackouts began. He was teaching a group of teenagers basic first aid in the church basement when the doors burst open and Mayor Hawthorne strode in, flanked by 3 men Marcus didn't recognize. They weren't from Millbrook, their clothing was too clean, their gear too new, and their eyes held the cold professionalism of hired muscle. "This gathering is unauthorized and potentially dangerous," Mayor Hawthorne announced, his voice echoing in the small space. "Everyone needs to disperse immediately." The teenagers looked frightened, but Marcus remained calm. He'd dealt with petty authoritarians before, and he knew that showing fear would only embolden them. "Mayor Hawthorne, these kids are learning skills that could save lives." "I'm not sure what's dangerous about that." "The dangerous part is that you're operating outside official channels," one of the hired men said, stepping forward. Marcus noticed the tactical vest under his jacket, the way his hand rested near his sidearm. In times of crisis, unauthorized groups can become breeding grounds for sedition. Marcus almost laughed. Sedition? For teaching kids how to treat wounds and purify water? But he kept his expression neutral. I'm not sure who you are, but this is a private gathering on private property. We're not breaking any laws. Laws change during emergencies, the man replied. I'm security contractor Pete Williams, and I've been authorized by the mayor to maintain order in this community. That means all activities need to be cleared through proper channels. Now the pieces were falling into place. The mayor had brought in outside security, probably using emergency powers to bypass normal hiring procedures. It was a classic power grab, and Marcus had seen it play out in dozens of failed states. The local strongman brings in loyal enforcers who have no ties to the community and no qualms about using force against civilians. Kids, why don't you head home? Marcus said quietly. Practice what we learned today. As the teenagers filed out, Marcus could see the fear in their eyes. These were good kids from good families, and they'd just gotten their first taste of how quickly freedom could disappear. It was a lesson Marcus wished they didn't have to learn so young. Once the basement was empty except for Marcus and the mayor's group, the conversation took a darker turn. You're going to shut down this little operation of yours? Mayor Hawthorne said, his voice losing its political polish. The mutual aid network, the neighborhood groups, all of it. It ends now. And if I refuse? Marcus asked. Pete Williams smiled coldly. Then we'll have to consider you a threat to public safety. Emergency powers give us a lot of latitude in how we deal with threats. Marcus felt the familiar weight of decision settling on his shoulders. He could back down, play along, and watch the mayor's cronies consolidate their power while vulnerable people suffered. Or he could stand his ground and face whatever consequences came. The choice should have been harder, but after Afghanistan, after watching good people die while corrupt officials profited, Marcus found it surprisingly easy. I understand your position, he said finally. But I'm not going to stop helping people just because it inconveniences your power structure. The mayor's face reddened. You're making a mistake, Thompson. A big one. Maybe, Marcus replied. But it's my mistake to make. After they left, Marcus sat alone in the church basement, weighing his options. He could run, pack up his few belongings and disappear into the mountains he knew so well. But that would mean abandoning people like Martha Rodriguez, abandoning the teenagers who were finally learning to be self-reliant, abandoning everything he'd built in Millbrook. Or he could stay and fight, knowing that the mayor now had professional muscle backing his authority. It wouldn't be a fair fight, but Marcus had never been in a fair fight. In Afghanistan he'd learned that sometimes the only way to defeat a corrupt system was to expose it, to force it to reveal its true nature to the people it claimed to serve. That night Marcus made his decision. He would stay and he would escalate. If Mayor Hawthorne wanted to play the role of petty dictator, Marcus would make sure the whole town could see exactly what that looked like. The next morning Marcus began phase 2 of his operation. Instead of hiding his activities, he made them as visible as possible. He set up a resource distribution point in the town square, right across from the mayor's official center. He posted schedules for his first aid classes on the community bulletin board. He organized work crews to help elderly residents with basic maintenance and security. Most importantly, he started documenting everything. Every time someone was turned away from official aid, every time the mayor's cronies helped themselves to supplies meant for the community, every time Pete Williams or his men intimidated civilians, Marcus made sure it was recorded and shared throughout his network. By the end of the week, the battle lines were clear. On one side stood the mayor's committee, backed by hired security and controlling the official channels of power. On the other side stood Marcus's network, growing larger each day as more people realized that the official response was designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The war for Millbrook's soul was about to begin in earnest. The first real test of strength came on a Monday morning when Marcus's network attempted to distribute food outside the high school. Word had spread that a family with 3 young children had been denied aid because the father had spoken out against the mayor's rationing policies. Marcus decided to make their case a public issue. He arrived at the school at dawn with a dozen volunteers, including Martha Rodriguez, who had become one of his most dedicated supporters. They set up a simple table with basic supplies and a hand-lettered sign reading "Community Aid, No One Left Behind." Within an hour, a line of people stretched around the block. Marcus was handing out canned goods to a young mother when Pete Williams arrived with 4 of his men. They moved with military precision, spreading out to control the crowd's movement while Williams approached the table. "You were warned," Williams said, his voice carrying across the square. "This is an illegal gathering." "Actually, it's not," Marcus replied calmly. "We're on public property, we're not blocking traffic, and we're not charging money. This is protected assembly." Williams smiled without humor. "Emergency powers supersede normal constitutional protections. You need to disperse immediately." The crowd began to murmur nervously. Marcus could see fear in their faces, but also something else: anger. These people had been pushed around for 2 weeks, told to trust a system that was obviously failing them. Now they were watching that system's enforcers try to prevent them from helping each other. "I'm not dispersing," Marcus said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "These people need help and we're going to provide it." Williams nodded to his men, who began moving toward the crowd. "Anyone who doesn't leave in the next 60 seconds will be arrested for disturbing the peace." That's when Martha Rodriguez stepped forward. The elderly widow looked tiny next to Williams's bulky frame, but her voice carried clearly across the square. "I've lived in this town for 40 years, she said. "I've seen good times and bad times. But I've never seen anything like this: armed men threatening people for sharing food with their neighbors." Other voices joined hers. A farmer named David Chin spoke up about his sick wife being denied medicine. A teacher named Lisa Park talked about her students going hungry while the mayor's friends ate well. One by one, people began sharing their stories of being failed by the official system. Williams looked uncertain for the first time. He'd been hired to intimidate a small group of troublemakers, not to suppress what was clearly becoming a spontaneous community meeting. His men were outnumbered 20 to 1, and the crowd was growing larger by the minute. "You have 10 minutes to clear out," Williams said finally. "Then we start making arrests." Marcus nodded. "Fair enough. But before everyone goes, I think they should hear about something I discovered yesterday." He pulled out a notebook and began reading from it. "According to my records, the mayor's committee has distributed 1,700 pounds of food over the past 2 weeks. That sounds impressive, until you realize that they've received over 4,000 pounds in donations and federal emergency supplies." The crowd began to murmur more loudly. Marcus continued reading. "The missing supplies aren't lost or spoiled. They're being stored in the mayor's brother-in-law's warehouse, along with medical supplies, generators, and other emergency equipment. Meanwhile, we're told there isn't enough to go around." The murmur became an angry buzz. Williams stepped forward, his hand moving to his weapon. "That's enough," he said. "You're spreading dangerous misinformation." "Am I?" Marcus asked. "Then let's go check the warehouse. Right now. All of us." The crowd began to move before Williams could respond. What had started as a food distribution had become an impromptu march toward the warehouse district. Marcus found himself at the front of nearly 100 people, all demanding to see how their donated supplies were being managed. Williams and his men followed, radioing for backup, but Marcus knew they were in an impossible position. They couldn't arrest 100 people, and they couldn't use force against what was clearly a peaceful demonstration. The mayor's power was about to be tested in the most public way possible. When they reached the warehouse, Marcus wasn't surprised to find it locked and guarded. What did surprise him was seeing Mayor Hawthorne himself waiting with additional security contractors, including some faces Marcus recognized from his military days, mercenaries who'd worked in Iraq and Afghanistan. "This is private property," the mayor announced. "Anyone who attempts to enter will be arrested for trespassing." Marcus stepped forward. "Mayor Hawthorne, these people have a right to know how their donated supplies are being managed. A simple inventory would clear up any confusion." "I don't have to justify my decisions to a mob," Hawthorne replied. "The committee makes allocation decisions based on objective criteria, not popular opinion." But the crowd wasn't buying it anymore. Too many people had seen too much, and Marcus's documentation had provided the evidence they needed to connect the dots. The mayor's brother-in-law owned the warehouse. The bank president who sat on the committee had been seen loading supplies into his personal truck. The grocery store owner was somehow never short of inventory despite the supposed scarcity. "Open the warehouse," someone shouted from the crowd. Others took up the chant, "Open the warehouse! Open the warehouse!" Marcus watched the mayor's face carefully. This was the moment of truth, the point where petty corruption either backed down or revealed its true nature. Based on the number of armed contractors now surrounding the warehouse, Marcus suspected he knew which way this would go. Mayor Hawthorne raised his hand for silence. When he spoke, his voice carried the cold authority of someone who'd finally decided to drop all pretense. "I'm declaring this an unlawful assembly," he announced. "Anyone who doesn't disperse immediately will be arrested. Anyone who resists arrest will be considered a threat to public safety. Marcus felt a familiar chill. He'd heard similar words from corrupt officials in Afghanistan, usually right before they ordered their security forces to open fire on civilians. The parallels were becoming impossible to ignore. The standoff at the warehouse lasted 3 hours. Marcus kept the crowd calm and organized while Mayor Hawthorne's security contractors took increasingly aggressive positions. It was a dangerous game of chicken, with the entire town watching to see who would blink first. Marcus had positioned himself at the front of the crowd, making it clear that any violence would have to go through him first. He'd seen enough civilians killed by nervous mercenaries to know that the situation could turn deadly at any moment. But he also knew that backing down now would mean accepting the mayor's authority permanently. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Deputy Sheriff Jake Morrison had been watching from the sidelines, clearly torn between his official duties and his personal convictions. As the tension reached a breaking point, he stepped forward and addressed the mayor directly. "Richard, this has gone far enough," Jake said. "These are good people asking legitimate questions. Let's just open the warehouse and show them what's inside." "I don't take orders from you, Morrison," the mayor snapped. "You work for me, remember?" "Actually," Jake replied, "I work for the people of this county. And right now they deserve some answers." It was a crucial moment. Jake Morrison was the only official with law enforcement authority who wasn't directly under the mayor's control. His support gave Marcus's movement legitimacy and protection that no amount of popular support could provide. The mayor seemed to recognize this as well. "Fine," he said finally. "But only a small group goes inside. And they go unarmed." Marcus nodded. "I'll take 5 people. We'll inventory what's there and report back to everyone." The warehouse was exactly what Marcus had expected, and somehow worse. Stacks of food, medical supplies, and emergency equipment filled the space, far more than had been distributed to the community. But it was the organization that really told the story. The supplies were sorted into 3 distinct areas: committee members, priority families, and general distribution. The committee members section contained the best of everything: fresh vegetables, high-end medical supplies, generators, and fuel. The priority families section was well stocked with standard emergency supplies. The general distribution section was nearly empty, containing only the most basic items in the smallest quantities. But the real revelation was in the corner office, where Marcus found detailed records of supply allocation. The mayor's committee had been receiving regular shipments of federal emergency aid, private donations, and supplies purchased with taxpayer money. They'd been distributing less than 30% of what they received, while stockpiling the rest for themselves and their preferred families. When Marcus emerged from the warehouse and shared what he'd found, the crowd's anger was palpable. These weren't radical malcontents or outside agitators. They were neighbors, friends, and family members who'd been systematically deceived by their own local government. "This is theft," Martha Rodriguez said, her voice shaking with anger. "They've been stealing from us while our neighbors went hungry." Mayor Hawthorne tried to maintain control. The committee made difficult decisions about resource allocation based on long-term sustainability. "We can't just hand out everything at once." But his explanations fell flat. The evidence was too clear, the disparity too obvious. Marcus had documented everything, and the people could see for themselves how they'd been betrayed. "I'm calling for a vote of no confidence," Jake Morrison announced. "And I'm requesting a full investigation into the mismanagement of emergency supplies." The mayor's face went pale. "You don't have the authority to do that." "Actually, I do," Jake replied. "Under county emergency procedures, law enforcement can intervene when local officials are suspected of corruption or incompetence during a crisis." Marcus watched the mayor's security contractors carefully. This was the moment when hired muscle had to decide whether they were working for a legitimate government or a criminal enterprise. Most of them were professionals who'd taken contracts they thought were legal. Finding out they'd been hired to protect corruption changed the equation significantly. Pete Williams was the first to step back. "This isn't what I signed up for," he told the mayor. "I'm not going to shoot civilians to protect your supply hoarding." One by one, the other contractors followed suit. They'd been hired to maintain order, not to enforce a corrupt system. Without their support, the mayor's authority collapsed like a house of cards. Within hours, the warehouse was opened and supplies were being distributed fairly for the first time since the crisis began. Marcus found himself appointed as interim emergency coordinator, with Jake Morrison's backing and the community's clear support. But Marcus knew this was just the beginning. The lights were still out, the infrastructure was still failing, and winter was coming. They'd won the battle against local corruption, but the real war for survival was just starting. That night, as Marcus stood in the town square watching families finally get the supplies they needed, he reflected on how quickly everything had changed. 2 weeks ago, he'd been a mechanic living quietly above a hardware store. Now he was essentially running a town of 3,000 people through the worst crisis in its history. The irony wasn't lost on him. The mayor had excluded him from leadership because he was an outsider, someone who didn't understand how Millbrook works. But it turned out that understanding how Millbrook worked was exactly the problem. The town's traditional power structure had been built on connections and favoritism, not competence or character. Marcus's military experience had taught him that real leadership meant serving others, not serving yourself. It meant making hard decisions based on what was right, not what was convenient. It meant earning trust through actions, not demanding it through authority. As he watched Martha Rodriguez helping to distribute food to families who'd been hungry for weeks, Marcus realized that the blackouts had done more than just cut off the power. They'd stripped away the comfortable illusions that had hidden Millbrook's problems for decades. The crisis had revealed who people really were when the stakes were high and the choices were hard. The question now was whether they could build something better from the wreckage of the old system. 3 weeks after taking over emergency coordination, Marcus faced his biggest challenge yet. The first snowfall had arrived early, and with it came the brutal reality that Millbrook was nowhere near ready for winter. The power grid showed no signs of coming back online, fuel supplies were critically low, and the town's heating systems were designed for a world that no longer existed. Marcus stood in what used to be the mayor's office, now converted into a crisis command center, studying maps and supply inventories by lantern light. The numbers were stark. They had enough heating fuel to last maybe 6 weeks if they rationed carefully. Food stores were better thanks to the recovered supplies from the warehouse, but still insufficient for a long siege. Most critically, they had no sustainable plan for the months ahead. "We need to talk about consolidation," said Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the town's only remaining physician. She'd become one of Marcus's most trusted advisors, bringing both medical expertise and hard-earned pragmatism to their planning sessions. "We can't heat every building in town. We need to identify the most efficient structures and move people together." Marcus nodded grimly. He'd been thinking the same thing, but it was a conversation he'd been dreading. Americans weren't used to giving up their private spaces, their independence, their individual control over their living situations. But Americans also weren't used to facing winter without electricity, natural gas, or reliable supply chains. "What about the school?" asked Tom Bradley, the former high school principal who'd emerged as a natural organizer. "The gymnasium and cafeteria are already set up for large groups, and the building is relatively new and well insulated." "That's a start," Marcus agreed. "But we'll need more than one location. And we'll need to establish clear criteria for who goes where and when." It was exactly the kind of decision that had gotten the previous administration into trouble, deciding who got priority access to limited resources. But Marcus knew they couldn't avoid making hard choices just because they were difficult. The difference was that these decisions would be made transparently, with community input, and based on objective criteria rather than political connections. The consolidation plan they developed was pragmatic but painful. Single individuals would be housed in the school gymnasium, with privacy created by hanging sheets and blankets. Families with children would get priority for the smaller, more private spaces in the library and classrooms. Elderly and disabled residents would be accommodated in the cafeteria, which had the best access to the kitchen and medical facilities. The hardest part was convincing people to leave their homes. Marcus had expected resistance, but he'd underestimated the depth of attachment people felt to their private spaces. Even facing the prospect of freezing to death, many residents struggled with the idea of communal living. "This is America," complained Harold Peterson, a retired insurance salesman who'd been one of the mayor's supporters. "We don't live in refugee camps." "You're right," Marcus replied patiently. "This is America. And in America we take care of each other when times get tough. Nobody's forcing you to move, Harold. But if you decide to stay in your house and you run out of fuel, we might not be able to help you." It was a blunt assessment, but it was honest. Marcus had learned in Afghanistan that sugarcoating hard truths didn't make them easier to accept. It just delayed the inevitable reckoning. The consolidation process revealed new challenges and new leaders. Martha Rodriguez, despite her age, became the coordinator for the school's living arrangements, using her natural diplomacy to resolve disputes about space and privacy. Tom Bradley organized work crews to winterize the buildings and set up communal facilities. Dr. Walsh established a basic medical clinic in the school's nurse's office. Most surprisingly, some of the teenagers who'd been in Marcus's first aid classes stepped up to become essential workers. 16-year-old Amy Foster became the town's primary radio operator, maintaining communication with other communities and monitoring emergency broadcasts. Her classmate Michael Torres organized the younger children, keeping them occupied and out of trouble while their parents worked on survival tasks. But the real test came when the second blizzard hit in early December. The storm was worse than anything in local memory, with winds that howled for 3 days straight and snow that piled up to the windows of single-story buildings. The power lines that had been damaged in the initial blackout were completely destroyed, making it clear that electricity wouldn't be returning anytime soon. Marcus found himself making life-and-death decisions on an hourly basis. When the backup generator in the school failed, he had to choose between using their limited fuel reserves to run the heating system or the communications equipment. When food supplies ran low, he had to decide whether to send teams out into the storm to retrieve supplies from abandoned houses or wait for the weather to clear. The storm also brought unexpected challenges from outside the community. On the second day, a group of armed men approached the school demanding food and shelter. They claimed to be from a nearby town that had been completely evacuated, but Marcus recognized the signs of a raiding party, too well-armed, too organized, and too aggressive to be genuine refugees. "We need supplies," their leader announced. "And we need them now." Marcus met them at the school's main entrance, flanked by Jake Morrison and a few other armed volunteers. The conversation was tense but civil, with both sides clearly assessing each other's capabilities. "We're happy to help genuine refugees," Marcus said carefully. "But we need to know who you are and where you're from. And we need to search your vehicles for weapons." The raiders' leader laughed. "You're in no position to make demands. We outnumber you and we're better armed." It was probably true, but Marcus had advantages the raiders didn't know about. The school's inhabitants had been drilled on emergency procedures, including how to respond to hostile visitors. Every adult had an assigned role, every child knew where to go for safety, and every potential weapon, from kitchen knives to improvised clubs, had been prepositioned. "Maybe," Marcus replied. "But this is our home and we're not going anywhere. So you can either accept our offer of reasonable assistance, or you can try to take what you want by force. But if you choose violence, you should know that you'll be fighting 300 people who have nowhere else to go." The standoff lasted for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Eventually, the raiders' leader decided that the potential cost wasn't worth the expected benefit. They moved on to find easier targets, leaving Marcus to wonder how many other communities were facing similar threats. That night, as the storm finally began to subside, Marcus called together his core leadership team. They'd survived the immediate crisis, but the encounter with the raiders had made it clear that their challenges were far from over. "We need to start thinking about defense," Jake Morrison said bluntly. "Those guys will be back or others like them will find us. We can't protect this place with good intentions and sharp sticks." Marcus nodded. He'd been avoiding this conversation, hoping that their remote location and harsh weather would provide natural protection. But the reality was that desperate people would take desperate measures, and Millbrook's accumulated supplies made it an attractive target. "What are you suggesting?" Dr. Walsh asked. "We need to organize a militia," Jake replied. "Train people to fight, establish defensive positions, create a command structure for security operations." It was a reasonable proposal, but Marcus felt the weight of its implications. They were talking about transforming their community from a group of survivors into something approaching a military unit. It was a logical response to the threats they faced, but it was also a step away from the civilian society they were trying to preserve. "Let's start with basic training," Marcus decided. "Teach people to use weapons safely, establish security protocols, create communication procedures. But let's also remember that we're not trying to become an army. We're trying to protect our neighbors so they can rebuild their lives." As the meeting broke up, Marcus stood alone in the darkened hallway, listening to the wind outside and thinking about the path they were on. 6 weeks ago, he'd been a mechanic who just wanted to help his neighbors. Now he was essentially the military commander of a fortified community, making decisions that would determine whether 300 people lived or died. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been driven by ambition or desire for power. It had been forced by circumstances, shaped by necessity, and guided by the simple principle that someone had to make the hard choices. Marcus had stepped forward because no one else would, and now he was responsible for consequences he'd never imagined. But as he walked through the school's dormitory areas, seeing families sleeping safely together, children playing quietly in the hallways, and elderly residents helping each other with daily tasks, Marcus realized that they were building something unprecedented. Not just a survival community, but a new kind of society based on mutual aid, shared responsibility, and earned leadership. The old America had failed them. The power grid was down, the government was absent, and the traditional systems of support had collapsed. But maybe, Marcus thought, they were creating something better from the wreckage. Spring arrived in Millbrook like a promise half remembered from a dream. After 5 months of brutal winter, the first green shoots pushing through the snow felt like miracles. Marcus stood in the school's courtyard, watching children play in the mud puddles while their parents planned the community's first major agricultural project. The sight should have filled him with hope, but instead he felt a familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. The radio crackled to life behind him, Amy Foster's voice cutting through the morning air. "Marcus, you need to hear this. Federal Emergency Management Agency is broadcasting on the emergency frequency." Marcus hurried back inside, where a crowd was already gathering around the radio. The message was brief and official. "This is FEMA Region 8 Command. Federal assistance is now available for affected communities. Report to designated relief centers for processing and relocation. Repeat, federal assistance is now available." The room erupted in excited chatter. After months of isolation, the idea of reconnecting with the outside world, of returning to normalcy, was intoxicating. Marcus listened to the conversation swirling around him, but his military experience made him cautious about anything that sounded too good to be true. "Where are these relief centers?" asked Tom Bradley. "And what do they mean by processing and relocation?" Those were exactly the questions Marcus had been thinking. In his experience, government bureaucracy didn't suddenly become efficient and helpful during crises. It became more bureaucratic, more controlling, and more focused on managing problems than solving them. "We need more information before we make any decisions," Marcus said, raising his voice to quiet the room. "Amy, see if you can make contact with other communities. Find out what they know about these relief centers." Over the next few days, Amy's radio work painted a disturbing picture. Communities that had reported to FEMA centers were being broken up, their residents relocated to different camps across the region. Families were being separated, with children sent to educational facilities, and adults assigned to work programs in distant locations. The justification was always the same: efficiency, security, and the need to prevent the spread of disease or civil unrest. But Marcus recognized the pattern from his military service. It was the systematic dismantling of organic communities and their replacement with managed populations. "They're not offering help," he told his leadership team during a private meeting. "They're offering control. The question is whether we're going to accept it." Dr. Walsh looked troubled. "Maybe we're being paranoid. These people have been through hell. If the government is offering real assistance, don't we owe it to them to consider it?" It was a fair point, and Marcus could see the appeal. Life in Millbrook had been hard, dangerous, and uncertain. The promise of professional medical care, reliable food supplies, and warm buildings was tempting. But Marcus had also seen what happened when people traded their independence for security without asking hard questions about the terms. "Let's put it to a vote," he decided. "But first, let's make sure everyone understands what they're choosing between." The community meeting that evening was the largest they'd held since the warehouse confrontation. Nearly 200 adults packed into the school gymnasium, with children playing quietly in the corners while their parents debated the future of their community. Marcus presented the facts as clearly as he could. FEMA was offering assistance, but that assistance came with mandatory relocation and the dissolution of their current community structure. People would be processed, assigned to different locations, and integrated into larger managed populations. "But we'd be safe," argued Helen Patterson, a widow with 2 young children. "We'd have heat, electricity, real medical care. My daughter needs surgery that Dr. Walsh can't provide here." "That's true," Marcus acknowledged. "But we'd also lose everything we've built here. The relationships, the systems, the independence we've fought for. And we'd be completely dependent on a government that left us to fend for ourselves for 6 months." The debate continued for hours, with passionate arguments on both sides. Some residents saw FEMA assistance as a lifeline, a chance to return to civilization and rebuild their lives. Others viewed it as a threat to the autonomy they'd earned through months of struggle and sacrifice. Jake Morrison raised a crucial point: what if they don't give us a choice? What if they decide that unmanaged communities are a security risk and force us to relocate? It was a question that had been haunting Marcus since the first FEMA broadcast. Government agencies that had been absent during the crisis were suddenly very interested in managing the recovery. That suggested motives beyond simple humanitarian assistance. We need to be prepared for that possibility, Marcus admitted. But we also need to respect whatever decision this community makes. People want to leave, they should be free to go. If they want to stay, we need to make sure they can. The vote was closer than Marcus had expected. 127 to stay, 89 to leave. It was a significant split, but it was also a clear majority in favor of maintaining their independence. More importantly, it was a democratic decision made by informed people who understood the consequences of their choice. The next morning, Marcus stood in the school parking lot watching trucks loaded with departing residents. Families who'd survived the winter together were saying goodbye, uncertain whether they'd ever see each other again. It was heartbreaking, but it was also necessary. People had to be free to make their own choices, even when those choices divided the community. Helen Patterson was among those leaving, her 2 children clutching stuffed animals as they climbed into the back of a neighbor's pickup truck. She stopped to shake Marcus's hand before departing. "I hope you're right about this place," she said. "I hope what you're building here is worth the risk." "So do I," Marcus replied honestly. "Take care of yourself, Helen. And if things don't work out the way you hope, remember that you're always welcome back here." As the trucks disappeared down the mountain road, Marcus turned back to face the remaining residents. They were a smaller group now, but they were also more committed. Everyone who stayed had chosen to stay, knowing the risks and accepting the responsibilities that came with independence. "All right," he said to the assembled crowd. "Let's get back to work." The weeks that followed were some of the most productive in the community's short history. Without the uncertainty of the FEMA decision hanging over them, people threw themselves into long-term projects with renewed energy. Solar panels were installed on the school roof, salvaged from abandoned houses throughout the region. A workshop was established in the old gym, where residents learned to repair and maintain equipment without relying on outside suppliers. Most importantly, they began expanding their agricultural efforts. The school's football field was converted into a large garden, with individual plots assigned to families and common areas maintained by work crews. It was hard labor, but it was also deeply satisfying. For the first time since the blackouts began, people were creating something instead of just surviving. The radio brought news from the outside world, and most of it confirmed Marcus's suspicions about the FEMA camps. Reports filtered back about overcrowding, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the systematic separation of families. Some communities that had initially accepted federal assistance were now trying to leave, only to discover that departure required official permission that was rarely granted. "We made the right choice," Amy Foster reported during one of their evening briefings. "But it's going to get harder. The government is classifying communities like ours as non-compliant populations. They're talking about mandatory integration for our own safety." Marcus nodded grimly. He'd been expecting this development, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. They'd proven that independent communities could survive and thrive, but that success was now being framed as a threat to social stability. "What does that mean in practical terms?" asked Tom Bradley. "It means they're going to try to force us to relocate," Marcus replied. "The question is when and how." The answer came sooner than expected. 3 days later, a convoy of military vehicles approached the school, flying both American flags and FEMA banners. Marcus met them at the main entrance, flanked by Jake Morrison and a dozen other armed volunteers. The convoy commander was an Army colonel named Robert Hayes, a career officer who carried himself with the rigid bearing of someone who'd never questioned orders. He presented Marcus with an official document declaring the Millbrook community a public health hazard and ordering its immediate evacuation. "You have 48 hours to prepare your people for relocation," Hayes announced. "Anyone who resists will be detained under emergency health protocols." Marcus read the document carefully, noting the vague language and broad powers it granted to federal authorities. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic overreach, using public health concerns to justify actions that would have been illegal under normal circumstances. "Colonel Hayes," Marcus said respectfully, "this community has been self-sufficient for 8 months. We've had no disease outbreaks, no public health emergencies, and no requests for federal assistance. On what basis are you declaring us a hazard?" Hayes's expression didn't change. "Unmanaged populations pose inherent risks to regional stability. Disease transmission, resource hoarding, potential for civil unrest. My orders are clear. And if we refuse to comply? Then you'll be in violation of federal emergency orders. The consequences will be severe." It was the moment Marcus had been dreading since the first FEMA broadcast. The choice between submission and resistance, between safety and freedom, between accepting government control and fighting for the right to live on their own terms. Behind him, Marcus could hear the quiet conversations of his neighbors, the people who'd chosen to stay and build something new. They were teachers and farmers, mechanics and nurses, teenagers and grandparents. They were Americans who'd survived the collapse of their old world and created a new one based on mutual aid and shared responsibility. "Colonel," Marcus said finally, "I'm going to need to discuss this with my community. Can you give us until tomorrow morning for our answer?" Hayes nodded curtly. 24 hours. But understand that this is not a negotiation. You will comply with federal orders or you will face the consequences. As the convoy withdrew to establish a perimeter around the school, Marcus gathered his people for what he knew would be the most important meeting of their lives. The choice was stark: surrender their independence and accept relocation, or stand their ground and face the full power of the federal government. "This is it," he told the assembled crowd. "This is the moment we've been preparing for since the day we decided to stay. The question is simple: are we going to fight for what we've built, or are we going to let them take it away?" The room was silent for a long moment. Then Martha Rodriguez, the elderly widow who'd become the heart of their community, stood up slowly. "I've been pushed around enough for one lifetime," she said, her voice steady despite her age. "I'm not going anywhere." One by one, others stood up beside her. Tom Bradley, Dr. Walsh, Amy Foster, Jake Morrison. Nearly every adult in the room rose to their feet, their faces showing the same determination that had carried them through the darkest winter of their lives. Marcus felt a surge of pride and terror. They were about to take on the United States government with nothing but hunting rifles and stubborn determination. It was either the most foolish thing they'd ever done, or the most important. "All right then," he said quietly. "Let's get ready." The final confrontation came at dawn on a Tuesday morning in late May. Marcus stood on the school's roof, watching federal agents take positions around the perimeter while helicopters circled overhead. The show of force was impressive and intimidating, designed to convince the holdouts that resistance was futile. But Marcus had learned something during his months of leading the community: people fighting for their homes fought differently than people following orders. His neighbors weren't soldiers, but they were defending everything they'd built together. That made them dangerous in ways the federal agents probably didn't understand. The siege began with psychological warfare. Loudspeakers blared messages about the futility of resistance and the consequences of defying federal authority. Helicopters hovered low over the building, their rotors creating a constant roar that made communication difficult. Spotlights swept the school's windows throughout the night, preventing sleep and creating a sense of constant surveillance. Marcus countered with his own psychological tactics. He had Amy Foster broadcast their situation on every emergency frequency she could access, describing their community's achievements and the government's attempts to destroy them. The message was simple: we are American citizens defending our right to live free. We have committed no crimes except the crime of independence. The broadcast found an audience. Within hours, similar communities across the region were reporting federal pressure to relocate. Social media platforms, where they still functioned, lit up with debate about government overreach and the rights of independent communities. News outlets began covering the story, though their framing varied dramatically depending on their political orientation. More importantly, the broadcasts reached other survival communities, many of which began organizing their own resistance. The federal government had assumed they were dealing with an isolated group of extremists, but they were actually facing a coordinated network of communities that had maintained contact throughout the crisis. On the second day of the siege, Marcus received an unexpected visitor. Colonel Hayes approached the school under a flag of truce, accompanied by a civilian official who introduced himself as Regional Administrator Carl Mitchell. "Mr. Thompson," Mitchell said, his tone more conciliatory than the colonel's, "we want to avoid violence here. These people have been through enough. Let's find a compromise that works for everyone." Marcus studied the administrator carefully. Mitchell was a career bureaucrat, the kind of person who'd risen through the ranks by finding ways to make problems disappear quietly. His presence suggested that the federal government was feeling pressure to resolve the situation peacefully. "What kind of compromise?" Marcus asked. "Limited autonomy," Mitchell replied. "You keep your community structure but under federal oversight. Regular inspections, mandatory reporting, coordination with regional authorities. You get to stay but you follow federal guidelines." It was a tempting offer, but Marcus recognized it as a trap. Federal oversight would gradually strangle their independence, turning them into a managed population while maintaining the fiction of self-governance. Within a year, they'd be effectively under federal control without the dramatic confrontation that full relocation would create. That's not autonomy, Marcus said. That's supervised imprisonment. Mitchell's expression hardened. It's the best offer you're going to get. Take it or face the consequences of continued resistance. Marcus looked back at the school where his neighbors were visible in the windows, watching the negotiation. They'd trusted him to speak for them, to make decisions that would determine their future. The weight of that responsibility was crushing, but it was also clarifying. We'll take our chances with resistance, he said finally. The assault began at 3 a.m. on the third day. Federal agents used flashbang grenades and tear gas to breach the school's main entrance while helicopters landed assault teams on the roof. It was a coordinated attack designed to overwhelm resistance quickly and minimize casualties. But Marcus had prepared for this moment. The school's layout had been modified over the winter with reinforced choke points, hidden passages, and prepared defensive positions. More importantly, the defenders knew every inch of the building and had practiced emergency procedures until they were second nature. The federal agents found themselves fighting room by room through a building designed to slow their advance. Barricades channeled them into kill zones where defenders could engage from cover. Hidden passages allowed the community's fighters to attack from unexpected angles and then disappear before counterattacks could be organized. Marcus coordinated the defense from the school's office, using a network of handheld radios to track the agents' progress and deploy his people where they were most needed. It was urban warfare at its most brutal, with federal agents struggling to distinguish between combatants and civilians in the chaos of close-quarters fighting. The turning point came when Amy Foster's radio broadcasts reached a National Guard unit stationed 50 miles away. Captain Maria Santos, the unit's commander, had been monitoring the situation with growing unease. When she heard federal agents using military tactics against American civilians, she made a decision that would define her career. "This is Captain Santos, Montana National Guard." Her voice crackled over the federal command frequency. "You are ordered to cease operations against American citizens immediately." The federal agents ignored her warning, but Santos had backup. Within an hour, her entire unit was surrounding the school, their weapons trained on the federal agents rather than the defenders. It was a moment of pure drama. American soldiers protecting American civilians from their own government. Colonel Hayes tried to assert his authority, but Santos held her ground. "These people have committed no crimes except defending their homes," she said. "I won't allow federal agents to massacre American citizens on my watch." The standoff lasted for hours, with federal agents caught between armed defenders inside the school and National Guard troops outside. Eventually, higher authorities intervened, ordering a withdrawal to avoid the disaster of federal agents fighting National Guard soldiers on American soil. As the federal convoy disappeared down the mountain road, Marcus stood in the school courtyard surrounded by his neighbors. They'd won, but the cost had been enormous. 3 community members had been killed in the fighting, including Tom Bradley, who died defending the school's main hallway. Several others were wounded and the building itself was badly damaged. But they had also proven something important. American citizens could resist government overreach when they were organized, determined, and willing to pay the price for their freedom. The news of their victory spread rapidly through the network of independent communities, inspiring others to resist federal relocation efforts. "What happens now?" Dr. Walsh asked, her voice exhausted but determined. Marcus looked around at the faces of his neighbors, people who'd survived the collapse of their old world and created something new from the wreckage. They were tired, scared, and grieving their losses. But they were also free, and they had earned that freedom through sacrifice and struggle. "Now we rebuild," he said simply. "We fix what's broken, we remember what we've learned, and we make sure this never happens again." The war for Millbrook was over, but Marcus knew that the larger battle for America's future was just beginning. Across the country, communities were choosing between federal control and dangerous independence. The outcome of that choice would determine what kind of nation emerged from the crisis. As the sun set over the Montana mountains, Marcus walked through the damaged school, checking on families and assessing the repairs that would be needed. The building was scarred but intact, like the community itself. They had faced the ultimate test of their values and emerged stronger, more united, and more committed to the principles that had brought them together. The old America was dead, killed by the failure of its institutions and the corruption of its leaders. But a new America was being born in places like Millbrook, built on the foundation of mutual aid, shared responsibility, and the hard-won knowledge that freedom was something that had to be defended, not just declared. Marcus thought about the future his community would build, the children they would raise, and the example they would set for other Americans struggling to find their way in a broken world. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be theirs. And sometimes that was enough.